Have you ever looked at the maintenance schedule in your owner's manual and wondered if it's really enough? If the manufacturer says your transmission fluid doesn't need to be changed until 120,000 miles, or maybe even it calls it lifetime, why do so many experienced technicians recommend servicing it so much sooner? And if you're simply following the maintenance schedule that came with the vehicle, could you actually be shortening its life without even realizing it? Those are some of the most common questions I hear. Today we're going to answer them. We'll talk about why manufacturers create maintenance schedules the way they do, what normal and severe service really mean, why fluids age even when your vehicle isn't being driven very much, and perhaps most importantly, how to decide which maintenance strategy makes the most sense for your goals as the vehicle owner. Now, before we get started, I want to make one thing very clear. This video isn't proving that your owner's manual is wrong, and it's definitely not about criticizing vehicle manufacturers. In fact, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the engineers who design these vehicles and the teams responsible for developing their maintenance schedules. Those schedules are backed by years of testing, engineering, and real-world data. But here's the important part, and it's the idea that everything else in this video builds on. The maintenance schedule in your owner's manual is designed to accomplish a very specific objective. The question is that objective the same as yours? Because there's a big difference between maintaining a vehicle so it provides reliable service for the average owner and maintaining a vehicle because you want to see it drive for the next 15 years or 300,000 miles on the odometer. And once you understand that difference, a lot of the conflicting advice you hear from dealerships to independent repair shops, friends and family, and of course the internet starts to make a whole lot more sense. So let's start by answering the question that almost nobody asks, but everybody should. Who is the factory maintenance schedule actually designed for? To answer that question, we first need to understand something that's easy to overlook. When an automaker develops a maintenance schedule, they're not creating it for only one specific driver. They're creating it for millions of vehicles that will be driven by millions of different people in every imaginable climate and under every imaginable driving condition. Now, some of those vehicles will spend their lives cruising down the interstate, while others will be driven through heavy stop-and-go traffic every day. Some will tow trailers through the mountains, others may only make short trips to the grocery store a few times a week, and many owners will trade their vehicles in long before they ever reach 100,000 miles. That's a tremendous number of variables for any manufacturer to account for. Because of that, maintenance schedules have to balance much more than simply maximizing the life of every vehicle. Manufacturers have to consider durability, warranty obligations, cost of ownership, environmental regulations, customer expectations, and years of engineering validation. Their recommendations have to work for millions of owners with completely different driving habits, maintenance habits, and ownership expectations. And I think that's where many people misunderstand the purpose of the factory maintenance schedule. The engineers aren't necessarily asking what maintenance strategy will allow every vehicle to reach 300,000 miles. They're asking a different question altogether.
It's an entirely different kind of flying, altogether.
It's an entirely different kind of flying.
What maintenance strategy provides reliable performance, reasonable ownership costs, and acceptable durability for the overwhelming majority of owners while balancing all of those other priorities? And those are two very different objectives. Now let's change our perspective for just a minute. When I'm talking with customers or maintaining my own vehicles, I'm not thinking about millions of cars. I'm thinking about one truck, one SUV, maybe one family vehicle, and obviously one owner who wants that vehicle to be as reliable as possible for as long as possible. And that completely changes the conversation. Instead of asking what's the minimum maintenance required for the average owner, we're asking, what's the maintenance strategy that gives this particular vehicle the best opportunity to live a long, dependable life? And that's why you'll hear sometimes different recommendations from experienced technicians than you see printed in the owner's manual. It isn't because one side is right and the other is wrong. It's because they're working towards different goals. I always tell my clients, my job is to make your vehicle last as long as possible. The manufacturer's goal is to sell cars. Before we start talking about engine oil, transmission fluid, brake fluid, and everything else, there's one more concept that you need to understand. In fact, this may be one of the biggest reasons people unknowingly maintain their vehicles differently than the manufacturer intended. Have you ever looked through your owner's manual and noticed that there are actually two different maintenance schedules? One is for what's called normal service, and the other for severe service. If you haven't, you're definitely not alone. In fact, I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of vehicle maintenance. The interesting thing is that severe service doesn't necessarily mean your vehicle has a hard life. It doesn't necessarily mean you're off-roading every weekend, you're towing heavy equipment across the country, or racing your truck through the desert. Those certainly qualify, but that's not what catches most people by surprise. Take a look at what manufacturers often consider severe service. That's frequent short trips where the engine never fully warms up, stop-and-go traffic during your daily commute, long periods of idling, driving in extremely hot or cold temperatures, towing a trailer a few times a year, dusty roads, mountain driving, even repeated trips where you only drive a few miles at a time. Does that sound familiar? For most of us, that's just everyday life. If you commute through the city traffic every morning, make short trips around town, or spend time sitting in traffic on your way home from work, there's a good chance your vehicle's operating under conditions that the manufacturer considers more demanding than normal. And here's why that matters. Those driving conditions generate more heat, more moisture, more contamination, and more stress on the fluids and components that keep your vehicle running. Engine oil may not get hot enough to evaporate moisture. Automatic transmission temperatures may climb during stop-and-go driving. The brakes work harder. Cooling systems cycle more frequently. Everything is simply working a little bit harder. And that's exactly why manufacturers often recommend shorter maintenance intervals for vehicles operating under severe service conditions. This is also why I encourage people to do more than just glance at the maintenance chart. Spend a few minutes reading the pages that explain what the manufacturer considers normal and severe service. You may discover you've been using the wrong maintenance schedule all along, not because you did anything wrong, but because you didn't realize your driving habits placed you in a different category. Now we understand how you drive affects your maintenance schedules. Let's answer another question that causes a lot of confusion. If a fluid still looks clean, does that mean it's doing its job? One of the biggest misconceptions that I hear is the fluid still looks clean, so it must be good. At first, that sounds perfectly reasonable. After all, if the oil, coolant, or transmission fluid still looks clean, what could possibly be wrong with it? The reality is, a fluid's condition has very little to do with how it looks. In fact, some of the most important changes happening inside a fluid are completely invisible to the naked eye. Think about what every fluid in your vehicle is asked to do. Engine oil has to lubricate moving parts, carry away heat, suspend contaminants, and protect internal components from wear and corrosion. Your transmission fluid doesn't just lubricate gears. It also operates hydraulic circuits, controls clutch engagement, and manages heat. Your coolant prevents freezing and overheating, and it lubricates the water pump while protecting the entire cooling system from corrosion. Brake fluid transfers hydraulic pressure every time you step on the brake pedal while resisting moisture and extreme temperatures. Those are pretty demanding jobs. Over time, every one of those fluids is exposed to heat, pressure, oxygen, moisture, microscopic wear particles, and repeated heating and cooling cycles. The additives blended into those fluids gradually become depleted, and the fluid itself slowly changes chemically. That process continues whether you drive your vehicle every day or only occasionally. That's why maintenance schedules are based on both mileage and, in many cases, time. A vehicle that only accumulates a few thousand miles each year isn't necessarily preserving its fluids forever. They're still aging. They're just aging for different reasons. This is also why I encourage people not to judge a fluid solely by its appearance. A fluid can still look perfectly clean while no longer providing the same level of protection it did when it was new. As technicians, we're concerned with what's happening on a microscopic level and a chemical level, not just what we can see with our eyes. Now, if all fluids gradually age and lose some of their protective properties, that naturally leads to another question. Why do some manufacturers refer to certain fluids as lifetime fluids? Does that really mean they'll last for the life of the vehicle? Or does that word lifetime mean something entirely different? And that's what we're going to tackle next. One of the most misunderstood terms in the automotive world has got to be lifetime fluid. I can't tell you how many times a customer has asked me, Keith, if the manufacturer says a lifetime fluid, why would I ever change it? I think that's a perfectly valid and fair question. And the answer starts by understanding what the word lifetime actually means. When someone asks me that question, I usually respond with one of my own. I say, call your dealership and ask them what the lifetime of your transmission is. Most people laugh because they already know the answer. Nobody can tell you that. It might last 80,000 miles, it might last 200,000 miles, it might last 500,000 miles. The truth is, nobody knows. And that's because there isn't one lifetime. Every transmission serves a different life. Some spend their entire existence cruising down the interstate with very little stress, while others spend years towing trailers, sitting in stop-and-go traffic, climbing steep grades, or making countless short trips around town. Even two identical vehicles can have completely different service lives simply because they're driven differently and maintained differently. So when I hear the phrase lifetime fluid, I don't think of it as a promise that the fluid will last forever. I think of it as the manufacturer saying that under the condition they've established and for the ownership expectation they've planned around, that fluid can perform its intended job without a scheduled replacement. But remember what we talked about earlier in this video? The manufacturer's goal and your goal might not be the same. If you're planning to trade your vehicle in after a few years, that maintenance strategy may be perfectly appropriate for you. But if your goal is to keep your vehicle for the next 15 years and drive it well past 200,000 or even 300,000 miles, it's reasonable to ask a different question. Instead of asking, will this fluid last a lifetime, I think a better question is, can replacing this fluid help my transmission live longer? That's a completely different conversation, and it's the one experienced technicians have every single day with their clients. We don't get to see transmissions when they're brand new. We see them after years of heat, wear, contamination, and real-world use. We see the vehicles that have been maintained, and we see the ones that haven't. Over time, those experiences shape our recommendations that we make to our customers. We all know that proper maintenance is one of the biggest factors in how long a vehicle lasts and how much of its value it retains over time. But good ownership actually starts before the very first oil change. It starts by buying the right vehicle in the first place. That's why I put together my free used car buying guide. It walks you through exactly what I look for when inspecting a used vehicle and helps you avoid some of the costly mistakes that can turn a good deal into an expensive repair bill. Simply scan the QR code on your screen or use the link in the description below to download your free copy now. If there were only one maintenance item you could afford to perform in your vehicle, changing the oil will be at the very top of my list. Nothing else even comes close to the return on investment that regular oil changes can provide. Most people think oil has just one job, to lubricate the engine. And while that's certainly one of the primary functions, modern engine oil does so much more than simply reduce friction between moving parts. In reality, it's one of the hardest working fluids in your entire vehicle. Engine oil helps carry heat away from critical engine components. It suspends dirt and microscopic wear particles until they're trapped by the oil filter. It protects internal surfaces from corrosion, helps seal the piston rings against the cylinder walls, and contains a carefully engineered package of additives that fight oxidation, neutralize acids formed during combustion, prevent sludge from formation, and reduce wear throughout the engine. Every time you start your engine, those additives begin going to work. And every mile you drive, they're slowly being consumed. The oil itself is also exposed to tremendous heat, repeated thermal cycles, moisture, fuel dilution, combustion products, and tiny metal particles created through normal engine wear. And even though the oil may still look clean on the dipstick, the chemistry inside the bottle has been changing since the day it was poured into the engine. This is especially true on modern engines. Today's vehicles are built with tighter internal tolerances, direct fuel injection, turbochargers, variable valve timing systems, automatic start-stop technology, and much longer factory oil change intervals than we saw 20 or 30 years ago. That's why choosing the right oil and replacing it at an appropriate interval is one of the smartest investments you can make in the long-term health of your engine. Compared to the cost of replacing an engine, routine oil changes are inexpensive insurance. So that brings us to one of the biggest debates in the automotive world. Should you really follow the oil change interval listed in your owner's manual, or should you be changing your oil sooner? Let's take a closer look. Here is probably one of the questions I'm asked more than any other. Hey Keith, how often should I change my oil? The truth is, there isn't a single mileage interval that's right for every vehicle and every driver and every driving condition. Anyone who tells you to change your oil every 3,000 miles or insists that 10,000 miles is always perfectly fine is oversimplifying a much more complicated subject. The first place I always recommend looking is your owner's manual. The engineers who design your engine know its oil capacity, its bearing clearances, operating temperatures, emission systems, and oil specifications better than anyone. Their maintenance schedule is an excellent starting point. But remember what we discussed earlier in the video. You also need to be honest about how you drive your vehicle. If your driving falls under the manufacturer's severe service conditions, those longer oil change intervals may not be appropriate. Frequent short trips, extended idling, stop-and-go traffic, towing, dusty environments, and extreme temperatures all place additional stress on the oil and can justify more frequent service. I also encourage people to think about their long-term ownership goals. If you're planning to keep your vehicle well beyond the warranty period and hope to drive it for 200 or even 300,000 miles, changing your oil sooner than the maximum recommended interval is relatively inexpensive compared to the cost of repairing or replacing your engine. It's one of the best investments you can make in your vehicle's longevity. Another factor that's often overlooked is time. Oil doesn't just age from mileage. Moisture, oxidation, fuel contamination, and other things continue to affect the oil when the vehicle isn't driven very much. That's why manufacturers almost always specify both a mileage limit and a time limit, whichever comes first. A vehicle that only accumulates a few thousand miles each year still deserves regular oil changes. People often ask me, what do I do with my own vehicles? Well, personally, I prefer changing the oil somewhere around the middle of the manufacturer's recommended interval, especially on vehicles I plan to keep for a long time. It's a maintenance philosophy that served me well over the years, and I often recommend it to customers who are focused on long-term reliability rather than simply getting through the warranty period. At the end of the day, there's no magic mileage that applies to every vehicle. The best oil change interval depends on the vehicle, the oil being used, the way you drive it, and most importantly, how long you expect that vehicle to remain in your driveway. If engine oil is the lifeblood of your engine, transmission fluid is the lifeblood of your transmission. And considering that replacing a modern automatic transmission can easily cost several $1,000s, it's a maintenance item that deserves serious attention. Many people think that transmission fluid simply lubricates the gears. That's only part of the story. In an automatic transmission, the fluid also creates hydraulic pressure to apply clutches and bands. It transfers power through the torque converter, removes heat from internal parts. It lubricates bearings and gears. It keeps countless valves and passages operating smoothly. It's doing multiple jobs every second your vehicle is moving. And just like engine oil, transmission fluid is exposed to heat, friction, and contamination. And every time a clutch pack applies, microscopic friction material is released into the fluid. And over time, repeated heating and cooling cycles begin to break down the fluid's protective properties. Elevated temperatures accelerate the aging process of the transmission fluid. And that's one of the reasons so many severe service schedules recommend shorter transmission service intervals. Unlike engine oil, transmission fluid doesn't usually become black overnight. In fact, it can still look fairly clean while its additive package has already begun to deteriorate. Once again, appearance alone doesn't tell the whole story. Fluid may still look good on the dipstick, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's providing the same level of protection it did when it was new. This is also where I hear one of the biggest myths in the automotive world. I've been told that changing transmission fluid will cause my transmission to fail. Let's talk about where that myth came from and whether there's any truth behind it. Over the years, I've heard this concern countless times. Keith, I've been told that if I change the transmission fluid on a high mileage transmission, it'll start slipping or fail. It's one of the most common automotive myths out there, and like many myths, it has just enough truth behind it to keep getting repeated. But here's what actually happens. Imagine a transmission that's gone well beyond its recommended service interval. The fluid is broken down, the additives have been depleted, and the internal clutch packs have experienced years of normal wear. By the time that vehicle shows up at a repair shop, the transmission may already be living on borrowed time. The owner decides to service the transmission, and a few weeks later, it begins slipping. Naturally, the conclusion is the fluid change caused the transmission to fail. In reality, the transmission was already failing. The fluid didn't create the problem, it simply couldn't reverse years of wear and neglect. I like to compare it to someone who has never been to the dentist. They finally schedule an appointment after 20 years and discover they need several root canals. It wasn't the dental visit that caused the damage. The problems had been developing for years. The visit simply revealed the condition that already exists. The same thing can happen with neglected transmissions. Fresh fluid can't rebuild worn clutch material, can't repair damaged seals, or restore components that have already reached the end of their service life. Maintenance is preventative by nature. Once significant wear has occurred, changing the fluid isn't a repair. And that's why I encourage people to service their transmission before there are symptoms, not after. Waiting until the transmission starts slipping, it shifts harshly, or makes unusual noises is a little like waiting for your engine to start knocking before deciding it's time to change the oil. Now, I also want to make something very clear. Every situation is different. A transmission with extremely high mileage and an unknown maintenance history deserves a thoughtful inspection before deciding the best course of action. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, and that's where the experience of a qualified technician becomes important. The real lesson isn't that transmission fluid is dangerous to change. The lesson is that preventive maintenance works best when it's actually prevented. So the next logical question becomes, when should you change your transmission fluid to give your transmission the best chance of living a long, healthy life? As with engine oil, the first place I recommend that you look is in your owner's manual. Some manufacturers provide service intervals, while others may only list a severe service interval or even refer to the fluid as lifetime, and that's your starting point. From there, I look at how the vehicle is actually being used. Is it towing? Does it spend its life in stop-and-go traffic? Does it see a lot of mountain driving or operate in extreme heat? Those conditions create additional heat inside the transmission, and heat is one of the biggest contributors to fluid deterioration. People often ask me what I recommend in my own shop. And as a general rule, I like to see automatic transmission fluid service somewhere between 30 and 60,000 miles, depending on the vehicle and how it's driven. Personally, I service a transmission in my own vehicle every 30,000 miles because my goal isn't just to keep them running, it's to keep them running for a very long time. This interval is what I consider best maintenance practices. Some people hear that and say, isn't that overkill? My answer is always the same. Compared to the cost of replacing a modern transmission, a routine fluid service is relatively inexpensive. I'd much rather spend a few $100s on a preventive maintenance service over the life of a vehicle than several $1,000s replacing a transmission that might have lasted longer with some regular services. Another question I hear all the time is whether you should perform a maintenance flush or simply drain and replace the fluid. And the answer depends on the design of the transmission and the manufacturer's service procedures. Some transmissions are designed to be serviced with a simple drain and refill, while others require specialized equipment to replace a larger percentage of the old fluid. The important thing is to follow the proper service procedure for your vehicle. The takeaway is simple. Transmission fluid isn't a lifetime investment. like every other fluid in your vehicle, it gradually loses ability to perform the job it was designed to do. Replacing it at a reasonable interval is one of the smartest things you can do to help extend the life of your transmission. Now let's move on to another fluid that often gets overlooked. When most people think about engine coolant, they think about one thing: keeping the engine from overheating. And while that's certainly one of the most important jobs, modern engine coolant does much more than simply regulate temperature. The coolant circulates through the engine, cylinder heads, radiator, heater core, thermostat housing, the water pump, and in many vehicles, even the turbocharger. As it travels through the cooling system, it absorbs heat from the engine and releases the heat through the radiator, helping the engine maintain a stable operating temperature under a wide variety of driving conditions. But temperature control is only part of the story. Modern coolant also contains a carefully balanced package of corrosion inhibitors and additives designed to protect the aluminum, the steel, cast iron, brass, copper, rubber seals, and plastic components throughout the entire cooling system. Those additives help prevent internal corrosion. They reduce scale buildup, lubricate the water pump, and protect the entire system from damage that can't be seen from the outside. And just like every other fluid we've discussed, those additives don't last forever. Over time, they become depleted. As they do, the coolant gradually loses its ability to protect the cooling system, even though it may still look perfectly clean inside the radiator or inside the overflow reservoir. I've had customers tell me the coolant still looks good, so I figured I didn't need to change it. Unfortunately, that's not a reliable way to judge the condition of the coolant. Just because it still has its original color doesn't mean that corrosion inhibitors are still doing their job. Once those additives are depleted, corrosion begins attacking the cooling system from the inside out. And that can lead to clogged radiator passages, heater core restrictions, water pump wear, deteriorated gaskets, and expensive repairs that often could have been prevented with just some routine maintenance. This is another example of why appearance can be misleading. You can't look at coolant and determine whether its protective chemistry is still intact. That's why replacing it at the appropriate interval is about far more than preventing overheating. It's about protecting every component the coolant comes in contact with. So that raises the next question. If coolant can still look perfectly good while its protective additives are wearing out, how often should you actually replace it? Just like the other fluids we've discussed, the first place to begin is again in your owner's manual. Modern coolants have come a long way over the past few decades, and many manufacturers now recommend replacement intervals of 100,000 miles or more for the initial service, followed by shorter intervals after that. Those longer intervals aren't necessarily wrong. Today's extended life coolants are far more advanced than the conventional green coolants many of us grew up with. They provide better corrosion protection and longer service life when the proper coolant is used and the cooling system remains sealed and contamination-free. People often ask what I recommend as a best maintenance practice. Personally, I like to service the cooling system approximately every 5 years or 50,000 miles at most, whichever comes first, especially on vehicles I plan to keep for the long haul. It's a relatively inexpensive service that helps protect some very expensive components. To me, coolant replacement isn't about fixing a problem, it's about preventing one. That's really the theme of this entire video. The best maintenance practices aren't designed to repair worn-out components. They're designed to help keep those components from wearing out prematurely in the first place. Now let's move on to another fluid that rarely gets the attention it deserves, even though it plays a critical role in your safety every single time you drive. Let's talk about that brake fluid. When was the last time you changed your brake fluid? For many people, the answer is never. In fact, I've met countless vehicle owners who didn't even know the brake fluid was considered a maintenance item. Unlike engine oil or transmission fluid, the brake fluid doesn't lubricate moving parts or carry heat away. Its primary job is to transfer the force from your foot on the brake pedal to the brake calipers or wheel cylinders, allowing your vehicle to slow down and stop safely. So why does it need to be replaced? The answer is moisture. Most brake fluids are hygroscopic, which means simply they naturally absorb moisture from the atmosphere over time. Even though the brake system is sealed, tiny amounts of moisture can still enter through rubber hoses, seals, and even the vent in the master cylinder reservoir. As the moisture content increases, two things begin to happen. First, the boiling point of the brake fluid starts to decrease. Under normal driving conditions, that might not be noticeable, but during repeated hard braking, towing, mountain driving, or emergency stops, the brakes generate a tremendous amount of heat. If the brake fluid begins to boil, it creates vapor inside the hydraulic system. Unlike brake fluid, vapor can be compressed, which can result in softer or spongy brake pedal and reduced braking performance. We call it brake fade. The second problem is corrosion. Moisture inside the brake system can begin attacking expensive components from the inside out. Master cylinders, ABS hydraulic control units, brake lines, calipers, and wheel cylinders can all be affected by internal corrosion. Many modern ABS systems are especially sensitive to repair, and many failures could have been delayed or prevented with routine brake fluid maintenance. The tricky part is that brake fluid often gives you very little warning. It can still look reasonably clean in the reservoir while the moisture content has already reached a level where it's no longer providing the protection it was designed to provide. That's another lesson we've seen throughout this video. The appearance of a fluid doesn't necessarily tell you anything about its condition. What's happening chemically is often far more important than what you see. So the next question becomes, how often should brake fluid actually be replaced as part of a best maintenance practice? As you probably guessed by now, my first recommendation is going back to the owner's manual. Some manufacturers specify a brake fluid replacement interval, while others don't include it in their regular maintenance at all. That doesn't mean the fluid lasts forever. Remember, brake fluid is constantly absorbing small amounts of moisture throughout its service life. Unlike engine oil or coolant, there's really no way to stop that process. It's simply the nature of brake fluid. As a best maintenance practice, I recommend replacing brake fluid about every 2 to 3 years, regardless of mileage. And for many people, time is actually a more important factor than miles because moisture continues to accumulate whether the vehicle is driven every day or it sits in the garage most of the week. One question I hear quite often is, can you test brake fluid? The answer is yes. There are brake fluid testers that can estimate the moisture content of the fluid, and they can be a useful tool when evaluating the condition of the braking system. But even without testing, routine replacement every few years is an inexpensive preventive maintenance that helps protect the entire hydraulic brake system. For me, the brake fluid replacement falls into the same category as many of the other maintenance items we've discussed. It's not about waiting for symptoms. It's about protecting expensive components before problems begin. That's what best maintenance practices are all about. Now let's move on to another fluid that's often forgotten until a pump starts whining or a steering rack begins leaking. Let's talk about the power steering. Power steering fluid is another system that's changed quite a bit over the years. Many newer vehicles use fully electric power steering systems that don't require hydraulic fluid at all. Others still use traditional hydraulic systems, and some manufacturers use electro-hydraulic systems where an electronic motor powers the hydraulic pump. So whether this maintenance item applies to your vehicle depends on what type of steering system it has. If your vehicle does use hydraulic power steering fluid, it's another fluid that often gets overlooked because many owners never think about it until they hear the pump whining or they notice a leak under the vehicle. Power steering fluid has a demanding job. It transmits hydraulic pressure to assist with steering, it lubricates the pump and steering gear, it protects internal seals, and it helps carry heat away from the system. Every time you turn the steering wheel, the fluid is working under high pressure as it circulates through the pump, the hoses, the steering gear or rack, and the reservoir. Just like the other fluids we've discussed, power steering fluid gradually deteriorates with age and use. Heat, oxidation, moisture, and microscopic wear particles slowly reduce its ability to lubricate and protect the system. As the fluid ages, it can contribute to premature wear inside the pump and the steering gear. Those are two expensive components that are far more expensive to replace than the fluid. One thing I've noticed over the years is that many power steering systems become noticeably quieter after replacing the old fluid. That's because fresh fluid restores some of the lubricating properties that have been lost over time. While it won't repair worn components, it can certainly help reduce wear going forward. Once again, this comes back to preventive maintenance. You're not changing the fluid because the system has failed. You're changing because you want to help prevent these expensive components from wearing out prematurely. Once again, this comes back to preventive maintenance. You're not changing the fluid because the steering system has failed. You're changing because you want to help prevent the expensive components from wearing out prematurely. As a best maintenance practice, I recommend servicing the power steering fluid about every 30,000 to 60,000 miles on vehicles equipped with hydraulic or electro-hydraulic steering systems. If the vehicle sees severe service or operates in extremely hot climates, servicing it a little sooner can't be a bad idea. One thing I don't recommend is waiting until the fluid is dark, smells burnt, or the power steering pump starts making noise. By that point, the fluid has often been deteriorating for quite some time, and the damage may already be starting inside the system. Think about the cost difference. Replacing a few quarts of power steering fluid is relatively inexpensive. Replacing a steering rack, hydraulic pump, or high-pressure hose can easily cost hundreds or if not thousands of dollars depending on the vehicle. One final point I'd like to make is this. Not every vehicle uses the same type of power steering fluid. Some require specific manufacturer's fluids, while others use automatic transmission fluid or a dedicated hydraulic fluid. Using the wrong product can affect steering performance and in some cases damage seals or internal components. So always verify you're using the correct specified fluid for your vehicle. Now we've covered the major serviceable fluids found on most vehicles, but there's one more maintenance item I want to talk about. It's probably the most misunderstood of them all. Your differential and transfer case fluids. Depending on what you drive, your vehicle may have one differential, two differentials, or even a transfer case in addition to the differentials. And these components are essential on rear-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, and all-wheel drive vehicles, yet they're some of the most neglected maintenance items I see. Their job is simple but demanding. Differentials transfer engine power to the wheels while allowing the left and right wheels to rotate at different speeds during turns. The transfer case, found on four-wheel drive and many all-wheel drive vehicles, distributes power between the front and rear axles and allows the drivetrain to operate in different driving conditions. Inside these components are precision machined gears, bearings, shafts, and in some cases clutch packs, all operating under tremendous loads. Unlike engine oil, these fluids aren't exposed to combustion byproducts or fuel dilution, but they still experience tremendous pressure, heat, and microscopic metal wear. Over time, the extreme pressure additives break down, and tiny metal particles naturally accumulate in the lubricant as the gears and bearings wear. That's why you'll often find a magnet on the differential drain plug. Its job is to collect those microscopic metal particles before they continue circulating through the gears and bearings. It's completely normal to see a light coating of fine metallic paste on that magnet during a routine service. What isn't normal are large metal flakes or chips, which could indicate excessive internal wear. Another thing many people don't realize is that differentials don't all use the same lubricant. Some limited slip differentials require special friction modifiers, while others require gear oils that meet very specific manufacturer specifications. So using the wrong lubricant can lead to noise, poor differential performance, or premature wear. And just like the other maintenance items we've discussed, this isn't about replacing fluid because something has failed. It's about giving those gears and bearings the best possible environment to operate in for hundreds of thousands of miles. The question becomes, what do I consider the best maintenance practices for servicing these differentials and transfer cases? As with every maintenance item we've already covered, go to the owner's manual. It's always the best place to start. Some manufacturers actually recommend every 15,000 miles for differential fluid. And as a best maintenance practice, I recommend replacing the differential and transfer case fluids approximately every 30 to 60,000 miles or sooner, depending on how the vehicle is used. Personally, if I own a truck, SUV, or performance vehicle that I plan to keep for many years, I'm much more comfortable servicing these components closer to the 30,000 mile mark. There's also one situation where I recommend changing these fluids immediately, regardless of mileage. If you've driven through deep water that's high enough to submerge the axle vents or the transfer case vent, it's a good idea to inspect the fluid for contamination. Water mixed with gear oil dramatically reduces its lubricating ability and can lead to corrosion and premature bearing failure if left unaddressed. By now, you've probably noticed the pattern. Every fluid we talked about has a different job, but they all have one thing in common. They protect expensive components, and every one of them has a finite service life. If you've been looking for one magic mileage interval that applies to every vehicle, you probably realize by now that it doesn't exist. Every vehicle is different, every driver is different, every climate is different, and every owner has different goals. Someone leasing a vehicle for 3 years doesn't have the same maintenance strategy as someone who hopes to drive the same vehicle for the next 15 years. And that's why I believe your owner's manual should always be viewed as the foundation for your maintenance plan, not necessarily the finish line. It's an excellent place to start because it was written by the engineers who designed your vehicle. But it's also written to cover those millions of drivers with completely different driving habits, operating conditions, and owner expectations. As technicians, we get to see something the engineers don't. We see the vehicles after 10, 15, and 20 years of real-world use. We see the ones that were maintained consistently, and we see the ones that weren't. We see which components tend to last, and we see which ones fail prematurely. Those experiences shape what I consider to be best maintenance practices. Does that mean everyone has to follow my recommendations? Of course not. But if your goal is to keep your vehicle as long as possible, avoid major repairs, and get the greatest return on your investment, I believe servicing critical fluids before they've reached the end of their useful life is one of the smartest things you can do. Maintenance isn't about spending more money. It's about spending a little money at the right time to avoid spending a lot of money later. And that's kind of a philosophy I've shared with my customers for decades, and it's the one that served them and me extremely well. Well, I hope this video has helped you understand not only what should be maintained on your vehicle, but more importantly, why those maintenance decisions actually matter. My goal has never been to convince you that your owner's manual is wrong. It's to encourage you to think beyond the minimum requirements and develop a maintenance strategy that matches your own ownership goals. Whether you decide to follow the factory schedule exactly or adopt some of the best maintenance practices we've discussed today, the important thing is that you're making an informed decision based on knowledge instead of myths or assumptions. As always, I want to thank you for spending some time with me here at the Autotech Garage. Truly appreciate your support and the incredible community that we've built together. If you found this video helpful, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know how many miles are on your vehicle and what maintenance practices have helped you keep it running strong. I read many of your comments, as many as I can, and your experiences often help other viewers as well. Be sure to check out our next video right over here. Until next time, take care of your vehicle, and it'll take care of you. Thanks for watching.